It began as a whisper, a mission no one was supposed to know about, a handful of Canadian pilots, a frozen airbase, and a Swedish jet that wasn't even part of NATO's front line. They called it a data evaluation flight, but those who were there knew it was something else entirely. Because when the Gripen E took off that morning, it wasn't just being tested, it was being trusted. And what it did over Canada's skies that day quietly changed the future of Western air power. To understand what really happened, you have to step back. For decades, Canada's air defense had one heartbeat: American, F-18 Hornets, F-35 deals, Lockheed briefings, Pentagon approvals. The relationship was so deep it felt unshakable. If the United States made it, Canada flew it. But behind that alliance, something was shifting. The world had entered a new kind of war, fast, unpredictable, full of drones, electronic warfare, and hybrid threats. And suddenly, countries like Canada started asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if supply chains break? What if we need independence, not dependency? And what if there's a jet out there that's smarter, cheaper, and built for survival that doesn't come with political strings attached? That's where Sweden entered the picture. When Canada launched its Future Fighter Capability project, most assumed the choice was already made. The F-35 was the obvious favorite, but deep inside the Royal Canadian Air Force, there were skeptics, pilots, engineers, strategists, people who'd seen what happens when politics chooses for you. They wanted to test everything, including the Underdog. So, when Saab offered to bring the Gripen E to North America, Canada quietly agreed. No big press conferences, no Pentagon fanfare, just a simple mission: gather real data. And that's when things got interesting. The Gripen E was unlike anything Canadian pilots had flown before. It didn't roar arrogance, it whispered intelligence. Every switch, every screen, every line of code was designed with one idea: make the pilot faster, not busier. Unlike most fighters, which lock nations into maintenance contracts and data-sharing dependencies, the Gripen was open, flexible. It could plug into NATO networks, but it didn't need them. It was a jet built for countries that wanted to fight their own way. To Canada, that meant something. Because for years, its pilots had flown in the shadow of United States systems. Great when they worked, frustrating when they didn't. The Gripen, on the other hand, gave them something they hadn't felt in years: freedom. The mission began at dawn. 2 Gripen S, 1 Canadian CF-18, and an unmarked support aircraft. The location: northern Alberta, cold, quiet, and far from curious eyes. On the surface, it was just an interoperability test, but according to insiders, the real goal was to see how the Gripen performed under Canadian conditions: harsh weather, remote bases, minimal support. Conditions the F-35 wasn't exactly known for loving, and that's where the Gripen began to earn respect. It took off from a short, icy runway without issue. Its onboard systems adapted instantly to extreme cold, and during combat simulations, the jet's radar suite picked up enemy aircraft faster than anyone expected. Even the technicians, used to the complexity of maintaining US hardware, were stunned. No massive support team, no classified parts, just a small Swedish jet that kept working. One pilot reportedly said, "It's like this thing was built for Canada." But what truly changed minds that day wasn't performance, it was philosophy. See, the Gripen E isn't designed to dominate through sheer size or stealth, it's designed to outthink. If the F-35 is a fortress, the Gripen is a fencer, quick, nimble, always calculating the next move. It doesn't try to disappear, it uses electronic warfare to make the enemy see everything but the truth. That's why some call it the ghost without stealth. When Canadian pilots realized the Gripen could jam, misdirect, and confuse targets without relying on expensive stealth coatings or secret bases, the mood changed. They weren't just testing a fighter anymore, they were watching a new kind of air combat unfold, one where intelligence mattered more than invisibility. After the mission, the data was analyzed, quietly, carefully. No one spoke publicly, but those inside the program began to talk. They said the Gripen had outperformed expectations, that it had adapted to Canada's digital systems flawlessly, that it had proven something crucial like a nation didn't need the most expensive jet to have the most effective one, And when that report reached Ottawa, it created ripples all the way to Washington, because suddenly, Canada wasn't just another F-35 customer. It was a country seriously considering an alternative, one that could rewrite NATO's procurement playbook. Of course, the pushback came fast. Lobbyists, political pressure, security concerns, whispers that going with Sweden would, risk interoperability. But those inside Canada's defense circles knew the truth. The Gripen was interoperable, just not dependent. And honestly, that's what made it dangerous to the status quo. For the Pentagon, the idea of a major NATO ally buying a non-US jet was more than uncomfortable. It was strategic heresy. Because if Canada could go Swedish, who else might follow? The irony was hard to ignore. While America spent decades pushing allies to buy into the F-35's vision of shared air power, Sweden quietly built something that gave those same allies a choice. A jet that could do 90% of what the F-35 could, at a fraction of the cost, and, well, without the political baggage. And that quiet mission Canada gave it, that was the proof Saab needed. Months later, analysts began noticing, these subtle shifts. Procurement timelines changed, negotiation documents were reviewed. Suddenly, the Gripen wasn't just a contender, it was a factor. Even if Canada eventually sticks with the F-35, the test had already achieved something bigger. It shattered the illusion that there was only one way forward. The Gripen had become more than just a jet. It had become a statement that small nations can innovate, that independence still matters. And that, well, brains can still outmaneuver budgets. In military circles, they call it the Cold Lake Test. Unofficial, unconfirmed, but honestly, unforgettable. Because that's where Canada quietly proved that the world's next great fighter might not come from a superpower, but from a small Nordic nation that never stopped believing in its own engineering. And while the Pentagon may never admit it, that test changed how they look at the future. Not because the Gripen won a competition, but because it won respect. As one Canadian pilot later told a reporter off the record, "We weren't just testing Sweden's jet, we were testing our own courage to think differently." That's what the Gripen mission was really about. Not politics, not contracts, but independence, the kind you earn when you stop following and start flying your own path. So when people say Canada quietly gave Gripen E a mission that changed everything, they're right, because it wasn't just a flight test, it was a message, written in contrails across a frozen sky, that the smartest jet in the world doesn't need to shout, it just needs one chance to prove itself. And on that cold Canadian morning, the Gripen E did exactly that. In a world full of giants, Sweden's fighter didn't just take off, it took over the conversation.